I wandered aimlessly through the deserted streets of the city, with my hands in my pockets and my thoughts lost in the darkness. It was a cold and rainy night, and the drops of water hit the wet asphalt in soothing accompaniment. So I didn't notice right away when I stepped on a paper object, scratching the sole of my boot. I knelt down and tried to pull it out from under my rain-soaked boots. What I found there took my breath away. It was a piece of paper torn from a diary, covered with a list of names written in black ink. At first, I thought it was a shopping list or something, but the names on it didn't seem to be related. Sarah Miller, James Smith, Maria Rodriguez, and so on. As I looked more closely, I was speechless. My name was last on the list. With my heart pounding madly in my chest, I tried to explain to myself what this list really was, and why my name was on it. As I scanned the paper, I felt a chill run down my spine. The others on the list began to be killed one by one, their names accompanied by the date and time of their death. It was obvious that someone was following this list in cold blood and enforcing it. I was quick to get up and start wondering who could possibly be responsible for these horrible crimes and why I was on this list. With every step I took in the direction of my house, I felt a sense of paranoia and terror surround me. It was clear that my life was in danger, and I had to do something to discover the reason behind this list and avoid becoming the next victim. I returned home in an increasingly heavy rain, the list seeming to plunge me into an abyss of questions and fear. I could feel the cold drops seeping under my clothes and soaking my hair. The paper with the macabre names seemed to be blown away by the strong wind, but I managed to save it before it was simply blown away. Arriving home, I tossed the paper on the nightstand, unable to explain the meaning of the list or who might want me dead. But terror haunted me, and I struggled to sleep that night full of questions. Finally, I fell into a deep, restless sleep. It was already midnight when I was suddenly awakened by a terrifying scream that tore the silence of the night. I sat up in bed, and before I could figure out what was happening, I heard a gunshot followed by the sound of broken glass. My heart jumped in my chest, and I jumped out of my bed in a hurry. I ran to the bedroom window and looked out into the street. What I saw there froze me in horror. A burning car cast distorted shadows on the walls of the houses, and in front of this apocalyptic scene, a body could be seen lying on the wet asphalt in a pool of blood. It was a woman, one of the victims on the list. As people began to gather around the body, I realized that I could not stand there and witness another man killed. It was obvious that someone was doing everything possible to complete this sinister list, and the next victim could be me. It was necessary to act now more than ever, to reveal the motives behind these murders, and to discover who the criminal was who hunted us down so cruelly. My future looked darker and darker, and the shadow of death hung menacingly over me. The city streets were now filled with the lights of police cars, and the sounds of sirens filled the air. Police and detectives were beginning to investigate the crime scene, but the killer seemed to have disappeared into the night without a trace. Despite all efforts, there remained a mystery somewhat stronger than law enforcement. With a heart full of fear, I made the decision not to spend the night at home. I knew that sleeping in my own house could make me an easy target for the criminal. I decided to get in my car and leave the city in search of a safe place to protect my life. I drove for hours, my heart still beating wildly in my chest, and my thoughts haunted by the image of the woman killed in the street. As the kilometers passed under the car's wheels, I tried to clear my thoughts and reveal the reasons behind this nightmare. However, behind me, a black car had started following me. The bright light from that car's headlights seemed more sinister than ever. I tried to stay calm and not panic, but the car kept getting closer and closer. In a moment of horror, I saw an arm stick out the window of the car that was following me, and a gun gleamed in its hand. The criminal was preparing to shoot. In an instinctive reaction, I hit the gas pedal of my car and tried to dodge the bullets. The frightful sound of gunfire filled the air, and the bullets seemed to sound like a choir of devils. The black car zigzagged after me through the deserted streets, and I felt like a moving target. My thoughts drifted to the woman killed that night and all the other victims on the sinister list. I understood that the murderer was determined to make sure that none of us would survive. With each pull of the trigger, the chance of escaping alive dwindled. As the black car got closer and closer, I tried to find a solution to escape this deadly race. Something had to change, or else my name was going to be next on the list to be deleted in cold blood. With bullets whizzing dangerously close to my car, I sped up in a last-ditch effort to evade the killer's attack. The streets were deserted and dark, and raindrops mixed with tears of fear on the windshield of my car. I made an impulsive decision. Instead of running forward down the main street, I made a quick turn down a side street, hoping I could escape the criminal. His car didn't hesitate and swerved behind me, too. It was clear that the killer was not going to give up easily. I zigzagged through the dark streets of the residential area, trying to use every curve to gain a few precious seconds. The bullets kept ringing, and every sound was a cruel reminder of the impending danger. In a moment of inspiration, I made another quick decision. I suddenly stopped the car in a park near a dense forest. I took the key out of the ignition and turned off the lights, trying to hide in the darkness. The black car sped past me, the screeching of tires lost in the distance. I stood there in the dark, listening to my heartbeat ringing in my ears. I knew I had to uncover the truth behind this sinister list and put an end to this nightmare. Patiently and cautiously, I waited a few minutes, making sure that the criminal did not return. Desperate, I returned home and locked the door with all the strength I could muster. I felt adrenaline pumping through my veins and my heart pounding with painful violence in my chest as the storm raged. I felt trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Thoughts were flying in all directions and unanswered questions haunted my mind. Why me? Why had this cursed list come into my hands? And how could I escape this relentless killer who now knew where to find me? At one point, the room I was in was suddenly illuminated by the headlights of a car that stopped in front of the house. The storm continued to grow louder and louder around me, and the gusts of rain sounded like eerie knocks. I ran to the window to see what was happening. The murderer was in front of my house, his car stopped and his gun in his hand. Incredulously calm, he got out of the vehicle and started approaching my house. I felt a terrifying nightmare gripping me from which there was no escape. As we waited in tension and terror, every second passed like torture. I heard the sound of the front door being forced open, and my heart was pounding wildly. I knew I was running out of time and pushed a heavy cupboard in front of the door to try and stop the criminal. As I desperately tried to call for help, I heard the front door being forced harder and harder. In a moment of pure panic, I went to the kitchen and grabbed the knife, using it as a last resort. With every second that passed, the fear gripped me more and more. Finally, the door was forced open and the criminal entered the house. The light of his flashlight brought out every dark corner of the room. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I hid, ready to defend my life by any means necessary. He began to search the house, and I held the knife in my hand, waiting for the moment when he would get closer to me. As we were in this silent confrontation, my knife and his flashlight, I knew that everything would be decided soon. In the darkness of the house, I heard the steps of the murderer getting closer and closer. Every sound seemed to ring like thunder in my head as I braced myself for the confrontation with death. The criminal entered the room where I was hiding. The knife was shaking in my hand, and my heart was beating with unstoppable violence. His flashlight passed over every corner of the room until the rays fell on me. In a cold voice devoid of any trace of compassion, he said, "You have no escape. You are last on my list." In a desperate impulse, I jumped at him, knife in hand, in an attempt to defend myself. A fearful struggle began in the darkness of the house. The bullets started ringing, and I felt them hit me in the chest. Pain overwhelmed me, but I continued to fight with the last of my strength. In a moment of confusion, I managed to swing the knife in his direction, and both wounds were aggravated. The murderer collapsed to the ground, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. With each labored breath, I understood that I, too, was one step closer to the end. My house was now surrounded by law enforcement. The knife and gun lay quietly on the floor, evidence of that terrifying night's confrontation. Without realizing it, I had collapsed to the ground. The fight with the criminal had completely exhausted me. The police and detectives entered the house, ready to deal with the shocking scene. Their strong lights illuminated every dark corner of the house, and anxious voices were heard as they discovered the scenes of battle and death. I fell unconscious while law enforcement took control of the situation. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a gloomy hospital, surrounded by doctors and police who were asking me worried questions and encouraging me. With a heavy heart, I learned that the murderer had not survived the confrontation. His dark history of revenge was emerging. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with the police to uncover the deep darkness behind that cursed list. We learned that this individual had been one of the survivors of a terrible robbery in the past, and the list was his sadistic way of avenging his fallen comrades on that fateful night. It was a macabre tale of revenge, in which his thirst for justice was fueled by cold blood. In time, we managed to put an end to this scary chapter, but the darkness and sadness that surrounded that mysterious list did not completely disappear. The memory of that night that had brought death and terror was a terrifying echo of the dark past that could never be erased.